Ladies and gentlemen, please silence your phones and hush your babies. The show is about to start.
Hi everyone, Nemo here. Welcome back, and what a week it has been. I don't know if any of you have heard, but the Mormon Church got in a little bit of trouble this week with the SEC. So I don't know a ton about legal stuff, generally. I don't know a ton about how these things work in America. So I've brought on a guest who will be able to explain these things for us a little bit better than I can, and then we can kind of push the international perspective and talk about what this means for the church. So without further ado, and to keep this nice and short, here is my friend Kolby. Hey Kolby.
Hi Nemo, thanks for having me on.
That's all right. Explain to the ladies and gentlemen who you are, what you do, why we've brought you on today.
Sure. Well, I'm a huge fan of your channel. I love your approach. I am an attorney that works in the state of Idaho. So I have previously appeared on the Mormon Stories podcast, done a series with Radio Free Mormon on his show, and recently did a series of episodes with Cults to Consciousness, Shalise and Solo. So I think my biggest objective is clearly to be on every ex-Mormon podcast without actually having my own.
Yeah, I mean, that's a solid life goal, and it seems like you're doing very well at it so far. So I'll pass you around the Brit Vengers next. So tell me a little bit about then. So you're a lawyer. You're practicing in Idaho. What kind of law are you practicing? Is it financial? Is it otherwise?
Yeah, so I have spent I work for the state, so I work the state side of things, and I have spent the last several years working tax. So
Right.
I work connected to a highly regulated field, not securities though.
All right. Okay, that makes sense. But generally, you know more about this than I do. So do you want to just start off by giving us some background and telling us a little bit about what went down and who the SEC even is and why they're involved and all that jazz?
Yeah, so I think really our starting kind of like our first question when we talk about the SEC. So SEC stands for the Securities and Exchange Commission. But before we even talk about what the SEC is, let's talk about what a security is, because I know this sounds silly to go this, elementary, but the truth is I didn't know what a security was probably until right around the time I went on my mission. Like I knew they had something to do with money and finances, but if someone asked me to like write down what a security was, I wouldn't have been able to. So
Sure.
I think it's important to say there are three types of securities. There are debt securities, equity securities, and derivatives. So a debt security is something like a bond. A debt is, someone else owes you money, so you're serving as a creditor. Equity is something like stock. So that's where you actually take an ownership interest in whatever company or corporation that you're participating in. And then derivatives get slightly more complicated. And again, I'm not a securities guy, so that's where I'm a little in over my head. But that's things like options, short sales, stock swaps.
All that good stuff that you'll learn about if you watch the amazing film The Big Short.
Exactly.
You'll learn about all that in that great old film. Okay, so how does the SEC play into that then? What do they do?
Yeah, so the SEC is a regulatory agency of the federal U.S. government. They have a threefold mission, according to their own website. That's to protect investors, to maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and to facilitate capital formation. So they also have a threefold mission.
As I say, I'm very wary of any organization that has a threefold mission, if I'm honest. Carry on.
Yeah, it's basically threefold mission versus threefold mission, I think.
Yeah, I think that's what this is.
That's right. So when we talk about, where did the SEC come from? Many people, even outside of the U.S., are aware that in the U.S. we had the Great Wall Street crash of 1929 that had, world effects and led to the Great Depression. In response to that, Congress passed the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. So it not only created the SEC, but it also gave it its, starting bones of what it's going to regulate. So it enforces the provision of that act and regulations that it's passed in response to them. It's interesting to me that the SEC was created in response to bad actors within the financial market that caused, the Great Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, because we kind of had this history where the SEC's constantly added things to its purview in response to crises in the market. So, for example, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 that was passed by Congress in response to major corporate scandals like Enron. And then we had the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act passed in 2010 in response to the credit crisis of 2008. And so we can see time and time again the SEC responds or Congress responds to this type of bad action, and the SEC is the arm of that.
Okay, right. So that's where they are. That's where they started. And so, what did they do when it came to the church? Right. Let's really explain to people, because a lot of people are throwing the word fraud out there. For example, the church has committed fraud, but actually, as far as I understand it, that's not within the purview of what the SEC did. So let's talk about that.
So in response to this ongoing investigation, the church and Ensign Peak offered to settle the investigation with the SEC. Now, I want to say, as I'm explaining this is not just my opinion. This is coming right from the order that the SEC issued and that the church agreed to. So these facts that I'm talking about here come right from something that the church agreed to in the SEC's order.
Yeah, that's right there in the summary. It's saying that they have gone to settle charges for $4 million penalty for Ensign Peak and $1 million penalty for the church itself.
Right. And so for anyone who hasn't actually read that order, the page you just had up was the actual press release on the SEC's website. And then if people click over to the right is where they can see the actual order that was issued. Yeah. So it's a 9-page document PDF that lays out what exactly was agreed to. So as part of the settlement to settle this ongoing investigation, the SEC or staffers at the SEC and the church agreed to certain findings and the entry of a cease and desist order with certain financial penalties. And I think you just laid it out. There was a $4 million penalty assessed to Ensign Peak itself as an entity, and then there was a $1 million penalty assessed to the church individually. What do you think the import of that is?
Well, that's really important because they can't lay all of the blame at the foot of Ensign Peak and its managers. They can't hold it at arm's length because the reason they were fined as an institution was because of their involvement with the whole process and their oversight and their authorization of this all to happen. Because as we'll see in the documents, the first presidency were the only ones that could authorize this and the ones that did authorize this. So they were the ones that instructed this to happen. Just to be clear then, the church admits, as part of this being published, the church accepts as true all the facts as laid out in this order, correct?
More or less. There's boilerplate at the beginning that lays out that, the church made this offer, that the SEC accepted this offer, but there is boilerplate that says, they're not admitting or denying the findings herein.
Right.
But it's important to say that's kind of a standard type of boilerplate thing. If this is what the church offered to settle the case, I think it's very fair to say that the church agreed that there was at least enough evidence in the SEC's file that this is what happened.
So the church can't turn around and say, this didn't actually happen, we just settled to make it go away.
I'm sure they're going to continue to say that. I think their press release kind of does say that, but I don't think that's the reality.
Okay, that's fair. All right, sorry, carry on.
No, so you asked a good question about fraud. I know I've seen, and fraud is one of those tricky words because colloquially, I think it means less than lawyers like I have to apply it inside of the courtroom. Fraud is a very specific thing. It can be very difficult to prove. So if someone were to ask the question, did the SEC find that the church and Ensign Peak committed fraud? The answer to that would be no. There was no finding of fraud in the order. I think as you and I have kind of talked about this a little bit behind the scenes, I would use, instead of the word fraud, I would use the words like intentionally misleading investment behavior. I think if one were to read the order, they'll see that that's laid out in great detail. And I think now we can kind of turn to the 2-paragraph summary. We're not going to read the entire, as you and I have talked about this, we're not going to read the entire order in detail, but we'll read this 2-paragraph summary really to give people a feeling for what was found by the SEC.
So that starts with the SEC's order, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay,
So,
I'll read that out then. That's fine.
okay, great.
So the SEC's order finds that from 1997 through to 2019, Ensign Peak failed to file Forms 13F, the forms on which investment managers are required to disclose the value of certain securities they manage. According to the order, the church was concerned that disclosure of its portfolio, which by 2018 grew to approximately $32 billion, would lead to negative consequences. To obscure the amount of the church's portfolio, and with the church's knowledge and approval, Ensign Peak created 13 shell LLCs, ostensibly with locations throughout the US, and filed Forms 13F in the names of these LLCs rather than in Ensign Peak's name. The order finds that Ensign Peak maintained investment discretion over all relevant securities, that it controlled the shell companies, and that it directed nominee business managers, most of whom were employed by the church, to sign the commission filings. The Shell LLC's forms 13F misstated, among other things, that the LLCs had sole investment and voting discretion over the securities. In reality, the SEC's order finds Ensign Peak retained control over all investment and voting decisions. And that's really important because essentially what they told everyone was that these are independent companies. We do not have control over how they invest or what decisions they make. When in reality, and what you find out later in the 9-page document, is that what they had done is they'd taken people with deliberately obscure and essentially ungoogleable names, put them in charge of companies based in Delaware, say, but those people actually resided in Salt Lake. They gave those companies phone numbers that went straight to voicemail, and the only time those voicemails were picked up is if they were from a government agency. All others were just deleted. So these companies did not exist. If I'm right in explaining it to the audience, a shell company is just that. It is a shell of a company. It is not a company that actually functions in the way that a company normally would. It exists purely as the appearance of a company into which you can put money so that it doesn't look like you have as much money as you do. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's exactly fair. And I think that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that if the church had actually given these shell LLCs, if they'd actually given them legitimate assets to manage, then everything that the church did would have been legal. They would have been legally allowed to allow these LLCs, if they're making those investment decisions independently and they're actually controlling the assets, they could have been able to file those 13Fs on their own. But it was because the church has such a hierarchical top-down structure that they did not allow Ensign Peak to allow these LLCs to actually manage anything except on paper. And that's where it becomes an issue, is basically creating these companies that exist only on paper to make it, like you said, very difficult for people to find the reality of the church's investment portfolio.
Yeah, because what you see later on in the document is the church realized when it first started making LLCs that some people were starting to link them. So they went to further efforts and they put renewed efforts in to obscure these things further, but I'm sure we'll get to that. Is there anything else you want me to read from the summary? Let's have a look.
I think we've hit the high level. I just want to read one last sentence from the summary.
Yes, please. Yeah.
It says, Ensign Peak developed its approach to filing Forms 13F in the name of these LLCs with the knowledge and approval of the church, which sought to avoid disclosure of the amount and nature of its assets. And that's where people, to come back to kind of the colloquial definition. Sorry, I was reading from the actual order. I think this is the press release.
Okay. Sorry, my bad.
No, that's okay. That same phrase is probably on that page also, but that's from the second paragraph of the order's summary on page 2 if people want to look it up. I think the reason that line in particular is important is as people read through the order in detail, you can see how much effort the church went to obscure its financial investment holdings. It really wasn't something that was accidental. Stuff like this only happens if that's your design.
Yeah. This is the first big red herring that people are trying to throw out there, is that it was just a filing mistake. And absolutely it was a technical problem. It was a technical issue, but it wasn't accidental. And in fact, one of the things the SEC stresses is that this was deliberate and effortful and, really took some work to make happen,
Yeah, and I think the reality, having worked in a highly regulated field. I think the reality people need to recognize is that churches in the U.S. have a ton of political power. It's just often like they're untouchable. So if the SEC continued this investigation, I think it's very important to note that like they would not punish the church for just failing to meet some tiny little technical requirement. They instead probably would have given them some direction that's like go and sin no more type direction. And I know that comes from Jesus, but we actually use that type of guidance sometimes with different actors when I've worked with regulators. And I think the issue here is if not for the intentional effort the church went through to hide its assets, I don't think the SEC would have taken action. So
well,
this
it's like
idea that
if I don't file my taxes properly, say, and then HMRC, as it is in the UK, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, they would come to me and say, no, you actually owe us a bit more tax. I'd be like, okay, cool, I'll pay it. That's not a fine. That's them just correcting my mistake. And that's fine. That's okay. That sort of thing happens. Mistakes are made. But this is not that. This is absolutely not that.
Right. And it wasn't like this was mistakes were made for just a few years, right? That's the other thing I think the order lays out in detail is that Ensign Peak was aware that they had this filing requirement and that they were relying on bad advice since at least 1998. That's that paragraph 7 right there. If you
By at least 1998, senior management at Ensign Peak was aware of Ensign Peak's requirement to file Forms 13F and communicated this requirement to senior leadership of the church. And then I'll read 8 because I'm sure we're going to talk about it. To prevent disclosure of the securities portfolio managed by Ensign Peak, the church approved Ensign Peak's plan of using other entities instead of Ensign Peak to file Forms 13F. The church was concerned that disclosure of the assets in the name of Ensign Peak, a known church affiliate, would lead to negative consequences in light of the size of the church's portfolio. Ensign Peak did not have the authority to implement this approach without the approval of the church's first presidency.
Yeah, and I think that paragraph is huge, right? And I think the other thing for people who are, maybe joined a little late, it's important to note that order that we're reading from was agreed to by the church. It came as a settlement offer from the church and from Ensign Peak. So if people are wondering why is that fact in here, the church agreed to that fact.
So that is like that's I guess what I'm trying to get across is that if it's in this order, the church has agreed to it.
Exactly.
The fact of the matter are included for all to see there. So this becomes problematic, I would suppose, because they did this to avoid disclosure of the amount and nature of its assets. That's becoming clear here. Which, when Ensign Peak the whistle was first blown on Ensign Peak, the church kind of owned up to that. And it kind of flew under the radar a little bit, I suppose. But if you want to read to us what Roger Clark said when in 2019, late 2019, the whistle was blown on Ensign Peak, and all of a sudden the Wall Street Journal's putting out articles about this $100 billion hedge fund that's the best kept secret on Wall Street, Go for it.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and read from the Salt Lake Tribune's reporting, and it has part of Roger Clark's statements, but they reported back when those disclosures came to light, Latter-day Saint officials kept the size of the church's $100 billion investment reserves secret for fear that public knowledge of the fund's wealth might discourage members from paying tithing, according to the top executive who oversees this account. So that is Roger Clark. He said, for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, tithing, donating 10% of one's income to the faith, is more of a sense of commitment than it is the church needing the money. And that's, again, Roger Clark, head of Ensign Peak, which manages the denomination's investment holdings, told the Wall Street Journal. He then said, so they never wanted people to be in a position where people felt like, they shouldn't make a contribution.
They shouldn't make a contribution. It's like, well, how little faith do they have in their own members if they think, if they find out we've got all this money, they'll stop being obedient to God's law? I'm sorry, bud. Just because you stop listening to God's law doesn't mean the members will. It's insulting to the members in some ways.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I would shift. I've seen a lot of weird apologetics over this, like from members and then from the church's newsroom. One of them is people pointing to like biblical stories where Christ
Hmm.
heals people and then tells them not to tell, basically saying, well, you know, Christ before has spoken to secrecy. And frankly, I just find those apologetics for this behavior really abhorrent, even though and I know you and I kind of differ on this. I'm not really sure that I believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ any longer, but man, it seems so weird to have an organization that says they represent the guy who said, "My kingdom is not of this world."
Hmm.
So know so much about the world and know so specifically about how to make money in the world.
Yeah, it's bad. It's really bad that Jeffrey R. Holland can ever get up there and talk about the parable of the rich young man and try and put that out there as some kind of story that applies to a church that has over $100 billion.
Right.
You know, I did a video after I visited Salt Lake and looked at the amount of homelessness in downtown Salt Lake, and quoted President Monson where he says, "Behold, you do love your money, your fine apparel, your riches more than you love the poor and the needy, the sick and the afflicted." It's like, well, the church is acting that way. They love this money more than they love the poor and needy around them. It's a big problem.
Well, and I
So,
think that's one of the things that's genius about, the scriptural story where Christ lays out that you can't serve two masters, right? And you
hmm.
cannot love God and mammon is I think what members are seeing is the corrupting influence that money has. Because when
Mm.
you're making money hand over fist, you get to this place where you start justifying behavior that if it were applied to any other faith system, like Mormons would not be making these excuses for the Catholic Church. They would not be making these excuses for the Jehovah's Witnesses if they were fined by a
Hmm.
federal regulatory agency, but they're willing to do it for their own faith system. And that's
Yeah.
part of what bothers me is just the inconsistency of the approach.
I mean, we've got a great comment here from Elliot Heath saying, "I'd love to see some references for any time Jesus is recorded to say anything positive about money." It's good. It's a good thought. I can't think of any times off the top of my head. If you can, put them in the comments, people. Times when Jesus was positive about money, when he made positive comments about money. Um, I just can't get over the fact that Roger Clark was so brazen and been like, "Yeah, we didn't tell people because we thought they might stop giving us their money." So then what we've established, and this, I know RFM's spoken to this a little bit, and it might be worth just speaking to it briefly, is that if you could establish that the church did actually keep its members in the dark purposefully to to have them continue to pay money, then is there a case that removes the First Amendment protections the church has to allow a lawsuit to reclaim tithing money that it was paid on false premise? Your
It's
thoughts?
possible. Yeah, it's possible.
Hmm.
I've talked with RFM about that, and I think we'll just have to see. I don't really want to say too much about that because I
Yeah.
do think that this may be a game changer. But the reality is, we'll just have to see.
Hmm.
The biggest movement we have right now on someone attempting to claim back tithing is John Huntsman's lawsuit. I think it's
Hmm.
John Huntsman's lawsuit out of the Central District of California. That's currently the appeal is pending at the Ninth Circuit. And we'll have to see if he has the ability to go back and amend his original complaint that started that lawsuit in regard to these disclosures. I think we'll see it. I'm sure that his lawyers are already thinking about that.
Hmm.
But yeah, it gets a lot more difficult, I think, for the church to say that people weren't relying on misrepresentations when you have an order from the SEC so clearly
Hmm.
laying out that they were misleading people on purpose to so that people would continue to pay tithing.
Yeah, it's just, and that's morally bankrupt. That behavior, I'll come out and say it. That sort of behavior is unacceptable. Um, so
Particularly, can I say
yes, please.
particularly when the church has given so many clear talks about how tithing applies even for the destitute. I know that
Hmm.
Lynn G. Robbins gave a talk that's literally titled that,
Hmm.
tithing a commandment even for the destitute. And, for people like me who kind of grew up in a middle class family and who continue along in a middle class family, paying tithing never put me in a place where my wife and I were choosing, like, are we going to pay our rent or are we going to pay for food for the kids or are we going to pay for tithing? I've never been in those shoes. But that to me is the most abhorrent and most egregious is that at the same time, the church knew it was under investigation for this issue with the Securities and Exchange Commission, it's allowing talks like this to go out the door in general conference.
Well, it's as immoral as when a general authority was speaking with the vice president of Zimbabwe and said, we're not a wealthy people, but we give what we can. The church at that time, Ensign Peak, is 5 times larger than the GDP of Zimbabwe. 5 times larger than the GDP of the entire country that he's in. But yet, Russell M. Nelson has the gall to go to Africa and say, you need to give us 10% of your money, and that's how you'll get out of poverty. I grew up in the sort of house where it wasn't poverty, but paying tithing was a big deal. Paying tithing was a huge deal, and we were often supported by the church because we'd ended up paying tithing, so then didn't have enough money. So the church, so it creates that almost that dependent cycle more. If you were just told, right, well then don't pay your tithing, just get on and try and build up your money, then that would be better. But no. And that's why I think we need to link back paragraph 8. And I'm going to put it full screen just to be absolutely clear about this. To prevent disclosures of the securities portfolio managed by Ensign Peak, the church approved Ensign Peak's plan of using other entities instead of Ensign Peak to file Forms 13F. The church was concerned that disclosure of the assets in the name of Ensign Peak, a known church affiliate, would lead to negative consequences in light of the size of the church's portfolio. So that echoes the sentiments that Roger Clark made publicly available a couple of years ago. Those are the exact same sentiments. Ensign Peak did not have the authority to implement this approach without the approval of the church's first presidency. So the church's first presidency are the ones on the hook for this, because they allowed it all to happen. And that's really key, because I think now what I'd like to do is explore some of the kind of the common apologetics. And I really want to put that out there. I want to put this out there, first.
Sacred funds are managed with great care and responsibility and seriousness by the leaders of the church. We believe in inspiration and revelation. The presiding councils of the church are all in there. Of course, we use professional people and staff, and they have great talents and abilities and expertise. But at the end of the day, the main decisions, are made by presiding councils according to the spirit of revelation.
So this idea that they can blame the lawyers, which is what people have been trying to do, is undermined by what Gerard Corset there, who was presiding bishop of the church at the time of that interview. So the presiding bishopric of the church, just to explain to those that don't know, are the ones that oversee the temporal affairs of the church. So they're just as much on the hook for this as the first presidency, really. If you want to use that generic term, presiding councils, it will be them, it will be the first presidency, possibly a couple of apostles are in there as well. Because it will be the council on the disposition of the tithes, right?
That was one thing I was going to hit, is the order uses... Lawyers do this stuff all the time, where we use a term that we define earlier in the order consistently throughout the order. And so the order uses this term senior leadership of the church. And it's very important to say that the SEC defined senior leadership of the church as the first presidency and the presiding bishopric. So when we're really talking about who was involved, who made these decisions, it's those basically 6 positions that were involved.
And so, as I'll get to later, I'll list exactly who that implicates now. I didn't focus so much on the presiding bishopric, but for example, Gary E. Stevenson was a member of the presiding bishopric and is now an apostle, and he was during the time of these problems. So, but that's really clear that if they want to blame it on the lawyers, if they want to blame it on Ensign Peak, they can't, because Corset there said in a official church newsroom interview to journalists to be put out there, and that was brought out just after Ensign Peak came to light. So this was the church's attempt to kind of get ahead of it. He said that it's all done by the spirit of revelation by the presiding councils of the church. So that firmly puts them on the hook for this. I can't stress that enough. They're the ones on the hook, which is why I've been calling for church discipline against them. And I'll a bit later I'll share my letter that I've sent out. So your thoughts on other apologetics?
Well, I was just going to say, if I can speak to the lawyers did it thing here. So as a lawyer that's had to give advice before, that sometimes I wish, a client's asked me, hey, we want to do this. Can we do it? And oftentimes my advice as a lawyer is going to have different avenues that are associated with different levels of legal risk. And I think as you look through the order, you can really see this reality laid out by the SEC and the church again, right? They both agree to this because lawyers don't just like walk into their client's office one day, particularly at an institutional level like this, and say, hey, this is what you need to be doing. That's just not the way things work.
No.
You're asked, can we do this? Does the law allow us to do this? And to be clear, sometimes, a client may want to take a more risky position. And I think that's clearly what happened with the church here, is they cared more about hiding those assets or making them more difficult to find than they did about just clearly complying with clearly established law. If they would have just continued to report using the 13F forms on Ensign Peak, or on the flip side, if they would have just respected those entities that they formed, those 13 shell companies, all of this would have been legal.
Board. Yeah.
Right. It would have been legitimate asset planning and wealth management. Can we pull up the order again? Let's hit
Yeah.
paragraph
I was just
11.
Yeah. That's fine. I was just getting that ready for you. So let's go there. Okay.
I just want to hit paragraph 11 because this whole apologetic that the church's press release really hit, like, this is the problem of the lawyers. I think this paragraph shows that's just not possible.
I'll read that out for you.
Okay, great.
Yeah. On March 15th, 2005, the church became aware that the public might link this first LLC to the church because the person signing Forms 13F was listed in a public directory as a church employee. To address this issue, on March the 21st, 2005, the senior leadership of the church, so the first presidency and the presiding bishopric, approved a new reporting entity to be created with, quote, better care being taken to ensure that neither the street nor the media could connect the new entity to Ensign Peak.
Before we move on, can you scroll down and read 15 in connection with that, Nemo?
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine. In 2015, Ensign Peak became aware that a third party appeared to have connected the holdings of various LLCs back to Ensign Peak, so the thing they were trying to avoid. Ensign Peak brought this issue to the attention of the church. The senior leadership of the church approved Ensign Peak's recommendation to, quote, gradually and carefully adapt Ensign Peak's corporate structure to strengthen the portfolio's confidentiality.
Yeah, so what do you think of those two paragraphs?
So basically, every time they went to the senior leadership of the church and went, yeah, someone might work this out. And they were like, well, then do more to make sure people don't. And they came back and said, oh, I think someone's starting to work this out. Well, then do more to make sure they can't. That's what the first presidency and the presiding bishopric may not have been. It would be a straw man even to say they were sat down meticulously working out, oh, well, if we do this, then this. If we do this, then this. They were clearly presented with plans, but they were the ones that had an objective for those plans. They were the ones that were saying, we want this kept confidential, make that happen. We want this made confidential, make that happen. That's right. Their involvement in this. They were the ones with the desire, drive, and motive. They weren't necessarily the ones that actually put that out there. And so when the church says in its Q&A, shall I bring that up, actually? Let's bring that up.
Sure.
Because the church in its Q&A, can't answer questions that it asks itself, but even above that. So
while you pull that up,
can
I say one more thing in defense of the lawyers? Obviously, it's the 99% of lawyers who give the rest of us a bad name, as I've said before. So one more thing I think in defense of the lawyers here is that you can see that this was the objective. Like, the SEC order lays out so clearly that this is what they were tasked with doing. Like, find some way for us to keep this as confidential as possible. And so, of course, that's what the lawyers ended up recommending. But to this idea that, like, well, we just got bad advice from our lawyers, I guess I would ask, so if I, as a lawyer, give bad advice to my client over and over and over again, and it results in this huge disaster of the SEC taking action against my client, you would think that if the church really was just caught on the hook for bad legal advice, surely they would fire the attorney or the attorneys who are responsible for that advice, right? But we never see that type of action. We saw the same type of apologetics after the Arizona Bisbee AP sex abuse article came out, linking it with Merrill Nelson. And, like, there's no accountability. Like, so that apologetic to me just is ridiculous. Like, if it really was the fault of the lawyers and not of the leaders, then surely they would fire their counsel, but they don't.
Yeah. And you would think, because the way they phrase it here would lean to that. Did the church know about the practices of Ensign Peak described in the order? This is a Q&A that the church put on their own website. So these are questions that the church is making up, thinking that this is what people are likely to ask. And they have asked some quite direct questions here because they think people will ask those questions, like, did Ensign Peak fail to comply with SEC regulations? That is a direct question. It could have a yes or no answer. So did the church know about the practices at Ensign Peak described in the order? The church's answer: the church's senior leadership received and relied upon legal counsel when it approved the use of the external companies to make the filings. Ensign Peak handled the mechanics of the filing process. The church's senior leadership never prepared or filed the specific reports at issue. Well, of course they didn't. Of course, Russell M. Nelson wasn't sat there filing the reports, but that wasn't the question. The question was, did they know about the practices at Ensign Peak described in the order? And not only is the answer yes, the answer is yes, because that's what they wanted to happen. Those are the practices that they wanted to come about.
Yeah, and I think this answer in particular, this Q&A, just shows you how deficient the church's leaders are at actual leadership. Like, I've had leaders and bosses before who say, you know, me or another colleague have made a minor mistake, but the boss approved it. Real leaders take responsibility for their, like, if the buck stops with you, the buck stops with you. And it's very clear inside of Mormonism that the buck stops with the first presidency. Yet anytime a mistake is made, they're always trying to shift blame to the people who advise them. And I just find that so ridiculous at this point. Like, how many times do they have to push someone under the bus, but not hold them accountable, not make them, you know, not serve the church anymore before people stop buying this excuse?
Well, because they'll even blame God and Jesus before they'll blame themselves. If you look at the Gospel Topics essay on race and the priesthood, they essentially throw God under the bus, being like, "Hey, God was the racist one. We just did what we were told." It's like, okay, right? Is that the avenue they really want to go down? Fine. Apparently, it seems so. The other question here I wanna look at is: did Ensign Peak fail to comply with SEC regulations? Simple yes or no question. Their answer: we reached a resolution with the SEC. We affirm our commitment to comply with the law, regret mistakes made, and now consider this matter closed. Again, it's a simple yes/no question. Just answer it. Did Ensign Peak fail to comply with SEC regulations, Kolby? Yes.
The answer to that question is a clear yes.
It is absolutely a clear yes.
It's so ridiculous that they can't just answer that question yes. But we have now made it right. Like, that would have been a way to honestly answer the question instead of this, like, propaganda spin that the newsroom is so notorious for, in my view.
Because all they have to do is say, yes, we made a mistake. We've paid the appropriate fines. Let's move on. And people would find it much easier to move on because they'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, no, a mistake was made. You know, they don't even have to declare their motives because the motives have already been declared by the SEC, but they don't have to reaffirm that to the public. They don't have to say why they made mistakes because they weren't actually mistakes. They were deliberate actions. But, you know, they could look at it retroactively as a mistake to have made those deliberate actions, right? You could look back at it and go, yeah, it was a mistake for us to do that. We did it on purpose, but we shouldn't have done that. So, you know, that was a mistake on our part. That was a misstep. And yes, we haven't complied with SEC regulations.
I also think it's very telling that the church's press release does not link to the SEC's either press release, if I'm correct, or the order. Because if they really cared about giving their members the information, which again, the order they agreed to, this was their offer of settlement to make this go away. And I think it's very telling that they're not even willing to link to that from their website. That says a lot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And another point I want to make, I want to ask what your thoughts are, if there are any more on the Q&A you have, before I move on to another point in the order.
I think let's go back and hit the order. Yeah.
Okay, right. Because what I want to look at in the order is, and I just need to find it for a moment, but I mean, there's this paragraph 16, which is a doozy, which just says, on November the 6th, 2015, the senior leadership of the church approved Ensign Peak's plan for the creation of additional clone LLCs to further prevent disclosure of the church's holdings managed by Ensign Peak. Ensign Peak formed 6 additional clone LLCs, bringing the total to 12. So that's just hits the nail on the head. It's like, right, okay, yeah, they just kept doing this. They kept doing it, and no one seemed to mind, really.
I also personally love that the number they landed on was 12 at that point.
Yes,
I think that's
absolutely
that's
one
great.
for each of them.
That's right.
And you go through all this, and it talks about how the clones worked, etc. But
Can we hit paragraph? Can we hit paragraph? Man, I kind of want to jump to paragraph 32. This is probably the biggest revelation to me.
That's what I was looking for, 32 in the church audit department. So we're on the same page there. Let's have a look at that, shall we?
Do you want me to read that or you?
I'll read that. That's fine.
Great.
So the church and Ensign Peak continued to take the same approach to filing forms 13F through the clone LLCs, despite 2 church audit department, CAD, internal audits of Ensign Peak, one in 2014 and one in 2017, that reviewed the LLC structure. In discussion with Ensign Peak's senior management, although CAD did not recommend specific changes to the LLC structure, CAD highlighted the risk that the SEC might disagree with the approach. Now, I've gone over that in a short, and that's on my channel if you want to have a look at that. But when they come to you at the beginning of General Conference and say that it's all good, it's all been done in accordance with approved church policy, guidelines, and practices. But the problem is, the approved church policies, guidelines, and practices aren't acceptable to the SEC, it would seem. So that is a meaningless audit and a meaningless statement. Kolby, what are your thoughts on the church ignoring their own auditing department?
I think this is one of the most damning pieces to come out of the settlement, is that church auditing department basically raised this issue, specifically the last sentence, that though they didn't recommend specific changes to the structure, they highlighted the risk that the SEC might disagree with this approach. So that tells me someone inside of church auditing saw that this probably wasn't going to work, advised the senior leaders, and that was in 2014 and 2017. Here we are 9 years later from at least the first time, and this finally came to light. We had a question in the live chat. Do we know how long the church was negotiating the settlement? So we do know that it was going on for years. We don't know how many years, but the church lays that out in their FAQ, that they have been working on this for years. And remember, they knew they were working on the settlement for years, continuing to solicit tithing without telling you about the fact that they were under an active investigation by the SEC. That to me is just mind-boggling.
It is madness that they would continue to do that, and they continue to act as though all is normal. The moment that this sort of trouble started to happen, church auditing should have done something meaningful and said, here's what's going on, brothers and sisters. We're currently under investigation by the SEC.
Right.
But they know that that will cause members to go, oh, okay, what are they doing wrong? So I can kind of understand that. But I don't think, and what's really interesting is in the Church Handbook of Instructions, it says that serious sin is not dealt with by minimizing or hiding it, but by addressing it openly. I think that they should follow their own advice. This is not addressed by minimizing it and trying to keep it in the dark. Because all this does now, by waiting for the SEC statement to come out, is rather than the church getting ahead of it and saying, this is what they're going to find and here's what we did, it looks as though they've been found out by the SEC. I know, what do you think?
Well, and that's where I really love your approach, Nemo, just outside of even this specific issue, is I love how you have made a meaningful attempt to hold the leaders accountable to their own rules inside of their own system. Now, my opinion is they will never be held accountable because they refuse to take any accountability. And I think it speaks a lot about the system that they won't be made to account for any of this. But that's one of the things I love about your approach, is that you do try and see the good that's inside of the church, see the good that's inside of restoration scripture, and hold them to it.
Well, yeah, DNC 107, we'll get to this in a moment. I don't want to jump the gun, but we will get to exactly how the Church Handbook of Instructions and Scripture make it very clear what ought to happen now. And if there are any active believing members in the chat who are watching this, what you can do to try and make that happen, because things need to change. The church can't be an institution that is being called by the SEC for trying to hide things, not just from the public, because it would be different if they were doing this but telling the members. It would be different, but it wouldn't be better. It wouldn't be more legal, but it would be different. But they wouldn't even do that. They were trying to hide it from us, the people that they're meant to be watching over, the people they're meant to be looking after, the people that they have a pastoral duty of care towards, the people they have an ecclesiastical duty of care towards, the people whose souls they are responsible for. They just lie to, which is just unacceptable behavior.
Well, and if I can highlight, one of the things that really irritates me, the apologetics about this, one of the ones I've heard is like, well, the church is just, doing what it advises its members to do, to save up, to be financially responsible. And I think it's very important to remember the church had none of its own money. It's all tithing originally. It all came from people. And it really bothers me that that money was taken from people who gave it out of the goodness of their heart, who thought it would help people, or at least thought it would help the mission of the church. But this idea that then they were just one of the largest capitalistic corporations just making money hand over fist, that's just very different from what I believe the church was. And it's interesting to me that there are a few people even laid out in the course of this order that obviously dealt with cognitive dissonance and the consequences of what the church teaches and what it was actually doing. Can I introduce and then we can hit paragraph 34? That's what you wanted to do.
There we go.
Perfect.
Yeah. Right, I'll read that for you.
Well, can I explain what the business managers are for people who haven't read the order? So the business managers were basically the only people working for these shell companies. They were church employees, it says, for the most part. Again, you laid out the fact, Nemo, that they found people who had distinctly ungoogleable names. And so two of these business managers, it highlights here in 34, but that's what the business managers were, is they were working for these shell companies and basically being the only person who signed these 13F forms.
And they ought to have been residing in, say, Delaware or wherever these companies were, because those companies should have been doing business there. But they were signing forms electronically. Often the forms were being signed on their behalf before they'd even seen them. These forms were just getting signed and dealt with and moved on. So the only employee of these shell companies wasn't residing in the state where the company was. They were in Salt Lake City, and so they weren't undertaking any business for the company at the company's location. So that's another problematic point. But yeah, some of these guys grew a conscience, which is excellent. After the website reported this information, so a website basically aggregated that all these businesses were connected to the church through, I believe it was internet hosting. That's right. So the websites, the domain names were all registered to an entity tasked with overseeing the protection of the church's intellectual property. So I think that's Intellectual Reserve Inc., if I'm not mistaken. Each of the LLCs identified listed a business manager whose name matched that of a church employee. Now, they were ungoogleable, but once you notice that connection, you could essentially look into it and see if they did match up. After the website reported this information, two business managers resigned their roles, voicing concerns about what they had been asked to do. So two people who are quite high up in the church, you don't get into this position without having some mates. They said, I'm not doing this anymore. This isn't okay. And they voiced concerns about what they've been asked to do. Rather than changing the LLC structure, two new business managers were assigned to replace the two who had resigned. So the church had been told, not only by their auditing department, not only by two of their own members that this was wrong, but they still carried on and did it anyway. They just went, these guys, chickens, is this good old boys club and those guys weren't up to muster, so we'll just get two people who'll play the game properly, rather than actually listening to them. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think basically these business managers were set up almost probably from their view as like fall guys, right? They were the ones actually signing these forms. And the order lays out in detail how these forms, like you said, they were being signed basically intentionally misleading people. And so if you found yourself, I think of me being in that position. Like, what if I thought I really was doing what the Lord wanted and I was working for the church and I'm asked to do something that goes against my own personal morals? The fact that they resigned and spoke out against it, at least internally, I think says a lot about the integrity of most members of the church. I am so consistently impressed by the integrity of most members of the church. considering the integrity of the leaders, which I think there's a huge deficit on one side of that equation.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, like I said, props to these guys. These two guys, I don't know who they are. They're not named. But if you are watching this, or if anyone knows who they are, give them a hug, give them a clap. They deserve the credit for standing up and doing what was right, realizing, because like you said, if this had been done properly, what they were doing wasn't wrong, and they're just managing some money for the church. Fine, they're getting along. That's all right. But once they realize that what's going on isn't correct, they did the difficult thing and stood up and said, "No, this isn't okay," and the church just flat out ignored them and said, "Oh well, off you pop then." So those guys, big kudos to them. Big kudos to them.
Yeah, should we hit the two more kind of common Mormon apologetics I've heard on this issue? Okay.
Yeah.
So the first is people who are willing to ignore this lying and kind of shift the focus and just want to talk about how much money the church has and what it will be used for. I think it's very important to say, like, I'm not complaining about that. I don't think you're complaining about how much money the church actually has with regard to this particular revelation that comes out of the SEC. Yes, I think people can legitimately complain about that and ask, does an organization that has this much money, can it really represent the guy who said his kingdom is not of this world? But it's important to say that's kind of a non sequitur straw man with regard to these particular revelations. Like we just talked about, this is about intentionally misleading investment behavior that was misleading not just members of the church, but the entire public, and was serious enough that the U.S. government had to take action against them.
I understand the libertarian argument that once the church gets hold of that money, it is theirs to do with as they please as long as it's legal. The problem is, this wasn't legal. This wasn't within the guidelines that the government had set out that they should be practicing within.
Exactly.
So, you know, that's the problem here. That's what's at issue. And then what's the other common apologetic you hear?
So the other one I've seen is things along the lines of, like, you know, people, including prophets, aren't perfect. People who work for the church aren't perfect. This doesn't affect my testimony. And I think, man, all I want to say to that argument is over the last year, we have had reporting on the church's systemic issues with child abuse, which, by the way, is the reason I left the church in the first place. Okay, so that's why I find myself where I am today.
Okay.
Then we have these revelations, and I seriously just want to ask people who say, you know, this doesn't affect my testimony. Like, at what point, like, what won't you defend? I guess if you're willing to defend systemic issues with child sex abuse based on advice coming from the same law firm, by the way, and now the church is in hot water because of the SEC violations, like, what won't you defend? Like, at some point, you really have to just ask yourself, is the church consistent with what it says it does, what it asks members to do? And I think this latest revelation is just another instance where the church has clearly shown that it doesn't hold itself or its leaders to the same standard that it ingrained in people like you and me.
And that's it's a question that I ask a lot when I've been dealing historically with, you know, my opposing vote because, you know, 7 of the current 15 have lied publicly. And so I put all that out there and I send it to Dan H. Oaks, 3,500 word document. It's all footnoted, sourced, whatever. And they clearly don't think that's enough. Okay, so what would it take then? That's my question. We have all these procedures laid out for when disciplinary action can be taken against the First Presidency, against the President of the Church. What does it take for a general authority to be released? What would it take for God to decide that they've led people astray? Because 150 years of systemic racism, that's not enough for God to remove prophets. Covering up or not covering up, but having systems in place that can be abused in such a way to allow child abuse to be covered up, that is a problem, but that is not enough for God to get rid of them. Intentionally misleading financial behavior to the detriment of members of their church and to the reputation internationally of God's one true church on earth, apparently it's not going to be enough. So what would be? And this is the question you have to ask those members, like you said. What would it take for you to go, I don't think he's a prophet? What would he have to do?
Right. And if people aren't willing to answer that question, I can't answer that question for people,
No.
right? And I wouldn't dare to. I don't have that arrogance to say, you have to apply the same conclusions I do. But I think that's where we really have to look to Enlightenment thinking and the scientific method and the principle of falsifiability. If a prophet can't ever be proven not to be a prophet, regardless of what they do, that's not faith at that point. That's just insanity. That's just insisting that you're going to follow someone regardless of what they do.
Well,
and I think it's
I always say that faith faith is belief in the absence of evidence. But what Mormonism teaches you is belief in spite of all the evidence. I'm not the only person that says that. Lots of other people say that. But that is what it comes down to. Sorry, carry on.
No, and I was going to say, the Book of Mormon there's still passages from it that are very meaningful to me, even though I don't believe that it has a legitimate historical core. But one of the most powerful parts of the Book of Mormon is 2 Nephi 4, called like Nephi's Psalm, where he talks about, feeling wicked, feeling down, and finding this redemption through Christ. And one of the things that he says there, and is in scripture all over the place, is it's a direction not to put our trust in the arm of the flesh. And for Mormons who would say, like, well, I just believe President Nelson is a prophet, regardless of what the SEC says, or regardless of what the AP says, regardless of what the facts say, my question would just be, then explain to me how you're not putting your trust in the arms of the flesh. Because to me, if you're willing to follow a man, regardless of what he does, and just assume that God is speaking to him, like, I don't see how that's any different than any other. Go ahead.
Simple thought experiment. Because you're right. You're absolutely right. Here's what we'll do. You accept that God revealed Scripture. If you accept that, if that's your premise as a believing member of the church, God revealed Scripture. God set the standards by which we are to be judged. Correct? So if you find anyone in the church, D&C 107 makes it clear, none are exempt from the justice and laws of God. If you find anyone in contravention of not man's laws, but God's laws, then surely something should be done about it. That's simple. When is a prophet not a prophet? When he's in the contravention of God's laws. If you want to play the game of the US government's not to be trusted and they've just stolen $5 million off the church, then what you need to ask yourself is, was it okay regardless for the facts that the church agreed to? Was it okay that the church misled you as a member over how they were using your money? Regardless of whether the US government's a mean old nasty scapegoat that takes people's money away, was it right for them to lie to you as a member of the church? Because we believe in being honest, true, chaste, benevolent. We believe in those things. We believe in honoring, obeying, and sustaining the law. So if what they were doing wasn't right, according to God's law, not just the law of the land, should they face church discipline for it? And if you don't mind, Kolby, that's where I'd like to introduce my letter that I have just sent, if that's all right.
Yeah, let's shift to that. That's great.
Let's shift to that. Because I can get on my soapbox a little bit too much. This letter is in the description, people. You can download it. You can send it to your state president should you wish. I'm not going to read through all of it, but I am going to point out, I'm going to read the opener. Dear brethren, on behalf of myself and concerned members of the church globally, we find ourselves at a loss of how to reconcile the contradiction between being asked to account for our own honesty and integrity in temple recommend interviews and having to sustain brethren who are seemingly unaccountable in matters of being honest in their dealings and finances. Common consent is being ignored, and yet the scriptures and handbook are very clear on just how this matter can be dealt with. I understand the likely response to this email would be an insistence that the First Presidency are blameless and the fault lies with myself. However, if this is the case, please counsel me as my priesthood leaders as to why this is so, in spite of the clear case for church discipline against those involved in the intentionally misleading investment behavior which has violated and betrayed the sacred trust of church members as outlined below. I then outline exactly what happened and exactly what me and Kolby have been talking about here. I outline that because LLCs were formed in 2001, 2005, 2011 and 2015, that implicates the following. Gordon B. Hinckley, who's deceased, Thomas S. Monson, who's deceased, James E. Faust, who's deceased. Then Thomas S. Monson again as president of the church, then Henry B. Eyring, who's still with us, and Dieter F. Uchtdorf, because they were in the first presidency from 2011 to 2015. I then point out that according to point 31 of the order, they were reviewed. The financial behaviours of Ensign Peak was reviewed every year, and so potentially that implicates the current first presidency of the church. And then Gary E. Stevenson's also implicated because of historic position within the presiding bishopric. Then I invite them to consider the Church Handbook of Instructions. When it talks about serious sins are deliberate and major offences against the laws of God, and it lists fraudulent acts and violations of trust as serious sins. It says a membership council must be held regardless of a member's level of spiritual maturity and gospel understanding in cases of serious sin while holding a prominent church position or financial predatory behaviour. It goes on to say that investment fraud and similar activities require a membership council. A general authority general church officer is required to attend a membership council if they commit a serious sin while holding that position, which these men did. Membership councils are to protect the integrity of the church, and it is not protected by concealing or minimizing serious sins, but by addressing them. And then I point out that D&C 107 teaches that none are above the justice and laws of God, and that if the president of the high priesthood shall transgress, which is the president of the church, that he can be had in remembrance before the common council of the church. Any stake high council is equal in authority to the quorum of the 12 in the first presidency, according to D&C 107. Therefore, that authorizes stake high councils and bishops to take action and initiate church disciplinary procedures. And I'll read the last paragraph, and then Kolby, I want to get your thoughts. I am therefore calling for church discipline against the first presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Unfortunately, given the span of the financial behaviour that was subject to the SEC order, it must also be called for against Dieter F. Uchtdorf, given his position in the first presidency from 2008 to 2015. I also call for church discipline against the presiding bishopric, Roger Clark as managing director of Ensign Peak, and any others who have taken part in publicly embarrassing this church and undermining its integrity through this financial behaviour. They have betrayed the sacred trust of tithe-paying members who trusted them to handle their offerings with uprightness and propriety. Joseph Smith himself submitted to church disciplinary councils. Are the current senior leadership of the church less accountable than Joseph Smith? A council must be called to address the financial behaviour of the aforementioned senior church leaders and any others involved. None are exempt from the justice and laws of God. So I want to put that out there, that if any of you want that, you can send it to your stake president. It's in the description. I would encourage you to send it to your stake president. CC your high council. CC any area authorities that you know. Because they have done something wrong. They're in violation of the church's own rules and procedures, and they need to be held accountable for it. Kolby, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, one, I love that you've laid out the basis for that, because I think it's very telling, right? The church is going to try and just make this go away. One of the statements that they made multiple times in their press release is like, we consider this matter ended. And the reality is it's been going on for years, and they just now saw fit to tell the members. So I like that you're trying to say, no, this matter is not ended. We have to have a conversation about this. And that's, I admire so much of your approach to handling the church and trying to make it better. I wasn't able to make that work for me and for my family, Nemo, but I really admire it. And I hope that I hope that it shakes something loose. I have zero faith that it will, because I think the leaders have shown over and over again that they refuse to be accountable to anybody. And that's where I would encourage people who still believe that there's a core in the church worth saving to follow your example. Like, if this bothers you, like, really get to the bottom of how you feel about it. And then act accordingly. Like, put some conditions on whether, I guess I would ask people to do this thought experiment and write down how the church today would look different if it wasn't led by God. If you still believe it is led by God, like in its every daily details, as Elder Eyring said in 2017, write down how it would look if it wasn't. If it was just led by a bunch of old men who are honestly trying to do their best, applying these principles that are, I think, a little over their head, ask how it would look. Because I think it looks exactly like that. I can't think of a single way it would look different.
No, I get that. And so I guess the other thing I'd like to say is that if my stake president often tried to shut down my concerns by saying, even if the dishonesty that you accuse them of is true, I wouldn't release a bishop or anyone else over that level of dishonesty. I'm like, fine. It's apples and oranges because they have a much the first presidency of Quorum of the 12 have a much larger influence, and they make bolder claims like speaking directly for God, not just to him, but on behalf of deity. But if you want to play that game, then you tell me any bishop or stake president that with church money was in violation to the tune of a $5 million settlement fee isn't receiving church discipline. Find me a stake president or bishop that wouldn't be receiving church discipline for that. With the church's money, doing things that cause the SEC to fine the church $5 million. Tell me they wouldn't receive church discipline.
Right? Or to take it to any other type of corporation or organization. Tell me leaders who can make decisions that get you in hot water with the SEC, lead to a huge hit in your public relations, and not be held accountable. Like, even if you take it outside of the gospel context, right? I think it just shows the true character of the church is that the leaders can't be questioned. Not really.
Boris Johnson resigned because he lied about some things. Liz Truss left, I'm talking about British Prime Ministers here, Liz Truss left office because essentially she put a budget out there that crashed the economy quite badly. And it's recovering now and it's fine. But her and Kwasi Kwarteng, it wasn't serviceable because their decisions led to problematic outcomes on a large scale. This is doing damage to the church's reputation. This is doing damage to the ability of members to pay tithing, because active believing members that I know who would not have a single problem paying tithing and now look at this going, is that the place I want my money to go? The church, by any way you want to look at it, from a believing standpoint, from a non-believing standpoint, it's not good for them, and something has to happen to show that this isn't going to go on again. That's why leaders stepping down, taking responsibility is good for companies, for corporations, for institutions, because it shows that things are going to be different because different people are now in charge. Things are going to be different because the same mistakes can't happen again, or are less likely to happen again, if someone else is calling the shots.
Yeah, and it shows that the principles of the organization matter more than any one particular person.
Yes,
that's one of my
absolutely.
biggest issues with the church as an organization, is that I like and agree with many of the principles that I took out of Mormonism. Like, I absolutely believe in the principle of do what is right, let the consequence follow. I absolutely believe in the principle of being kind to other people, to not seeking to find fault unnecessarily. And I'm sure there will be people who say that's all we're doing. We're not. Like, I'm not trying to just complain about the church. I will give them every benefit of the doubt. And the problem for me is that I tried that for the past year, giving them every benefit of the doubt, and they still let me down. Personally.
You know, if I was going to give the benefit of the doubt to the church, I would look at the fact that around 2018 is when changes started to be made. And you could give the benefit of the doubt and say, right, well, when Russell M. Nelson got in charge, when Russell M. Nelson took the reins, he made some changes. He got in there and changed some stuff. But he didn't do what he needed to do by being honest and open about what had been going on. He still tried to hide it.
Right.
So he's as culpable as the others.
Right. And what to me it shows is that the most important principle inside of the church is preserving the church's reputation and preserving the leader's image. People are usually willing to admit that the church leaders make mistakes kind of in the abstract, but usually if you follow that up with a question like, okay, well, what was the last mistake you made that bothers you? They often can't come up with anything. And that to me is just weird. Like, this should be affecting people, or at least causing them to scratch their heads and go, this doesn't sit right with me.
But I think, unfortunately, there is a group within the church that are pandered to by the senior leadership of the church, who hold a position of deep mistrust of the government, of deep mistrust of democratic process, without getting too much into the politics of that. But there's too much, that group has got a little bit too much sway in the church, and I think that rot is kind of setting in, and I think that's all that's going to be left of the church. I think those are the people that are going to be left. Those that everything is out to get them. It's not just about people persecuting them for the religion. It's people persecuting them over healthcare. It's people persecuting them over gun control. It's all these issues. People going after them over election fraud and all that sort of stuff. Like, when the entire world is out to get you, it's very easy to dismiss anything that threatens your worldview, because you can always just dismiss it as a threat. But if you're walking through life seeing that, you know, things can change and things can be different to how you thought they were, then this should scare you. seeing the church in this position, this vulnerable, having made this big a mistake, it should bother you, I think.
And I think the fact that most believing members of the church are not willing to hold the church leaders accountable, I think to me that's the real telling and disappointing part, is that I agree with so many of the principles. And like you've said, the procedure for disciplining the first presidency is laid out right there in the scriptures today. So you would wonder, why would that be in the scriptures if it's not to ever be used, right? Like God didn't give us that many scriptures in Doctrine and Covenants. That to me just speaks so much about the quality of this organization, that it values those men's, I'm going to put integrity in air quotes, integrity or perceived integrity, rather than the good principles that it espouses.
Yeah. And I just want to be clear, because I've seen someone in the chat, and I know this is going to like bite me in the bum if I don't make this clear. I'm not saying you can't hold some of the positions I described of mistrust of the government, of these things. All I'm saying is that predisposes you sometimes, or it certainly can predispose you to then viewing everything as a existential threat, and so you find it very easy to dismiss things and stay in your worldview, and that's why this won't bother those people. And I think that is what will set in with the church, that will spread, and that attitude is what will be left, because the church is going to keep making mistakes like this, and it's only people that kind of have that worldview that will remain. I hope that clears that up. But, that's just my thoughts, and you don't have to agree with them. So, on that note, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much, Kolby, for coming on. Any final thoughts from you?
Well, like I said, I just want to thank you so much for your channel. I think what you're doing is great. What you and the rest of the Brit Vengers are doing are great together. And it's been a joy to kind of watch your channel take off, particularly because you have such a charming and eloquent accent. But no, I love your approach to the church leaders. And honestly, I hope it continues to make the church a healthier place, because I think the reality is, if the church was the vision that I was sold originally, and I'm saying set aside all the problems with Joseph Smith, all the problems in history, and the church really was just a good, accountable organization today, something that I could be proud to be a part of, I would want to, kind of regardless of the historical roots, because there are so many good members of the church. And so I think kind of the last thing I want to say concluding is, while I will always criticize the leaders of the church for the mistakes they make and don't take true accountability or show true leadership to correct, I am not criticizing my believing friends and family. I know that they have, that the church is very important to them, that it gives them a good moral core, and that I think there are some people who are better in the church than outside of the church. And so thank you for allowing me to be on your show. I'm a huge fan, and I'm really glad that we were able to do this collaboration.
No, it's my pleasure, honestly. And someone in the comments has just said, our founding fathers encouraged a healthy suspicion of government because government equals power. I'm saying the key word there is healthy, and I'm going to leave it at that before all the constitutionalist Americans start like forming a mob against me, because I'm just a dirty old Brit, and we tried to tax them too much, and I'm paying for the sins of my father now. So keep your tea out of the harbour. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you can, please donate to the channel. It helps me keep doing this. That's greatly appreciated. But liking the video is free, so if you hit that thumbs up, that's also fine. Thank you very much, everyone. Please send that letter to your state president if you feel so inclined. I feel like the more state presidents deal with this, and the more of them talk to the area presidency, we may just get a bit of a movement going, and people asking the question as to why exactly are church procedures not being followed, given the fact that we have some problems going on at the top of the church. All right, take care, everyone. Have a great night, and we will see you soon. Bye now.